Today's psalm is like many psalms in the Bible where Israel delights in the fact that something terrible has ended, that God has rescued the people from usually an invasion by a foreign power, and all of the earth is called to rejoice. We hear this in this psalm and in many others where the rivers and the mountains should clap their hands and sing, and all the nations should be delighted that Israel has been delivered from its hardship by God. And all the nations should stream towards Israel in celebration. But why? If some other nation has conquered Israel, which happened a lot, why should that nation that did the conquering be happy that God has rescued Israel? At the very least, you'd think that they would be upset. And the fact is that Israel back then, some 3,000, 2,000 years ago, was just a small country by the Mediterranean. It was never an empire. It was frequently destroyed and conquered by empires, but it was never an empire itself. It was just a small little country of people who had strange ideas and strange food preferences and strange ideas about God. Why should the Israelites ever imagine that all of the nations would come streaming towards them to celebrate their salvation? Why should anyone care about a small nation, particularly this one, Israel? In our times, especially in the last few months, that question sounds incredibly naive. Of course Israel matters. Just look around. The whole world is concerned with what happens in Israel. The current invasion of Gaza by Israel has sent shudders through the entire world. College campuses are up in arms in a way that we haven't seen since the 1960s. Countries all over the world are taking positions for and against what Israel is doing in Gaza. In Ontario, an Ontario MPP an independent MPP, was barred from coming back into the legislature because she was wearing a Palestinian scarf. Jews in Canada are understandably worried about their safety as anti-Israel protests abound all over the city. Synagogues and bookstores have been defaced by graffiti. Some have had fires occur. Others have had things thrown through their windows, both in Montreal and Toronto. What happens in Israel obviously matters to what's happening here. And that's all true, and I want to talk about that a little bit later in this sermon. But to get there, I'd like to return to this psalm because I think that something in it can help provide perspective on what we're going through right now. The psalm imagines all the nations streaming towards Israel to celebrate their deliverance. The nations will celebrate because the Israelites are at peace again and God has saved them. And throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, there's this idea that Jerusalem, in particular, the holy city, is actually the center of the entire world. Here's how it's expressed in the prophecy of Ezekiel. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations, with countries all around her. Now, if you think about the geography, that doesn't make a lot of sense since there's water to one side of Israel. But the thought in the Hebrew Scriptures is that Jerusalem is the center of the world. In another place in Ezekiel, Jerusalem is referred to as the navel of the world. The navel of the world. Just as your navel is the center of your body, Jerusalem's the center of the world. And there's this idea that what happens to the Israelites matters to everyone else because the Israelites are kind of humanity's representative with God. within the logic of the Hebrew Scriptures, God chose the Israelites to be the first peoples that God revealed the fact that there's only one God. All those other nations are worshiping statues and statues made of wood and stone. They're worshiping no one. The only God who exists is me, and I have chosen you, the Israelites, to follow me. That's the conceit of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so when the Israelites are close to God, that means they're close to the truth which animates the entire universe. Because if you don't get how the universe works, then humanity's spinning its wheels. So the Hebrew Scriptures say when things are good for Israel, things are good for the world because we're learning more about how the world really works. And we are walking in tandem with God and what God wants for all of humanity, not just Israel. So Israel's story is presented as everyone's story, and their holy city in the Bible is presented as the center of the world. Now, this idea that one place in the world is the center is not unique to the Israelites. About a month ago, I was in Mexico, and I went for a holiday. It was nice after all the lead up to Easter to just relax and read some books by the beach. But I wanted to go to Cancun because I wanted to visit a particular Mayan ruin, which I hadn't been to before. It's called Chichen Itza. And it was a couple hours drive from my hotel, but I was happy to do it because it's spectacular. Chichen Itza is a complex of 26 buildings. Some of you have probably been there. Ruins that have been carved out of the rainforest. It was once surrounded by 35,000 people lived there. A combination of farmland and rainforest surrounded it. And it was built back in the 900s at the height of the Mayan Empire's influence. And in its center, there are 26 buildings, but in the very center, there's one building which stands out, which is taller than all the other ones, and it looks like this. This is the most important temple, known as the Chichen Itza, and it's a step pyramid. It's 9 stories high, so it's very tall. And on each side, there are 91 steps. That's why it's called a step pyramid. So there's 91 steps on each side, so there's 4 sets of 91. And then there's a platform at the top where the chief priest would make sacrifices and offerings to their chief god, the feathered serpent. The temple is aligned so that it's in the center of the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. At the spring and winter equinoxes, it casts perfect triangular shadows. So they really wanted this to feel as though it was totally at the center of their universe. And if you add the number of the steps, so 91 times 4, plus the platform at the top, that adds up to 365. So all the days of the year are encapsulated in this one building. And they use this building to make calculations about when to sow crops, when to harvest, and so forth. So for them, this building was the center of the world. It was the navel of the world. It was their Jerusalem. Anthropologists have found this idea that people believe that their religion has a center of the world. They've found this idea all over the world. So, for instance, among Muslims, the center of the world is this place, the Kaaba in Mecca. Each Muslim is called to visit, make a pilgrimage to the Kaaba at least once in their lifetime. And millions of people go every year. Among Australian Aboriginal nations, the center of the world is Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock. And among Christians, the center of the world is the cross, the place where Jesus was crucified. That's why we carry crucifixes around our necks, why we have them in churches, and why to Christians Jerusalem matters so much, because Jesus was crucified there. And Carl Jung long ago made the point that a cross is a center, right? If you think of a cross, it has a center in it. And the old crosses, all four of the cross's arms were the same size. So 1, 2, 3, 4 with a circle around it. That's what an old cross used to look like. So again, it's that idea that we have found the center. This is the center. Religions all over the world see themselves as the center of the relationship between humanity and the divine. Our challenge today, of course, is how to get all these different religions who think that they're number one to get along. Because they all think they're at the center of the world. But we do not all see God or the divine in the same way. So how do we deal with this? Well, for a very long time, the way Christians dealt with it was by saying, we're number one and everybody else is wrong, and we're either going to conquer them or convert them. It was that thinking which led to the Crusades, right? Back in the Middle Ages, where 4 times the Christians went down to Jerusalem to try and expel the Muslims so they could take over the holy city, so it could be the center of the Christian universe. That kind of thinking led Christians, when they arrived in North America and South America, to say, we've got the right faith, all of your faiths are wrong, you need to convert. So we forcibly converted indigenous peoples, and the residential schools program was part of that program to try and forcibly convert people. This sense of Christian superiority led to the horrific execution of 6 million Jews by the Nazis. They justified their actions based it on a twisted reading of Christianity. That act, what Jews now ask us to call the Shoah, not the Holocaust. The Holocaust means a burnt offering made to God, as though it's a good idea. So Jews have been asking us to call this the Shoah. So the Shoah so horrified people after the Second World War that a new age of dialogue began among the world's religions. Because we'd all seen that religion taken too far can have horrific results. Over the decades, there have been many conferences since the Second World War held between the major religions, trying to find a way to coexist. In the 1960s, the Roman Catholics made major strides in this direction with Vatican II, where they finally officially renounced the idea that the Jews were to be blamed for the death of Christ. And they started making bridges to talk to the Jews explicitly so that Catholics and Jews could get along. Protestants were actually further ahead in this. The World Council of Churches had its first meeting, I think it was in 1948, and they explicitly said, we need to have a conversation with the Jews so nothing like this can happen again. Today, it is not unusual to see faith leaders from different religions on the same stage with each other, sharing their wisdom. Here's a picture of Archbishop Desmond Tutu with the Dalai Lama. They're actually really good friends, and they've written books together. Here's a picture of Pope Francis with a Hindu leader in Sri Lanka. These meetings would have been completely impossible even a century ago. And although things are not perfect, and there are still holdouts, more and more world religious leaders have agreed to peaceful coexistence. Our scriptures may tell us that each of our faiths is the center of the world and the only one that God believes in. But in practice, we've come to believe and recognize that there are actually many centers of the world because God is everywhere, and God can be found everywhere. This is progress. This is something which goes beyond what's written in many of our religious texts, and it is a sign that I suspect God is happy to see this. God is happy to see that, especially when we don't agree, we can get along. But while all of this has been happening, in the background, something else has been transpiring in Western society. We've all lived through it, and we're witnesses to it every Sunday. And that is that more and more people have become disenchanted with religion and have stopped showing up to churches and synagogues and temples. And yet, these people who are no longer interested in religion are still concerned about social justice issues and morality. But when they take up positions on these issues, they now do so with a religious fervor. If you think about what evangelical preachers used to sound like back in the 1930s, yelling and saying, "This is it. You will be damned if you don't believe what I believe, if you don't get in line." That's what politics sounds like now. They act as though their position is the only correct position. And like traditional faiths, these political activists behave as though their view is the center of the world, and everyone should come streaming to the center to be where they will be right because they believe what the political activist believes, that they have a monopoly on truth. This week, we saw this in action on university campuses. In the United States and Canada, students against the war in Palestine have set up encampments on campus. They've argued that the war in Gaza is genocide. They've demanded that universities divest of any of their investments in Israel. And in the papers this week, student leaders at both McGill and U of T, where there's encampments at both, have said that they set up the tents because they had no other choice. Nothing else that they had done had worked. So this was all they could think to do of next, is set up encampments. That kind of reasoning is a big problem. It's the adult version of a temper tantrum. If we don't get our way, we will shut everything down. Now, there's a bit of a difference between the United States context and the Canadian context here. The American encampments happened during the end of the school year. There were still a few weeks to go of classes. But in Canada, classes are over. So U of T set up its tents once classes were over. So smart, I guess. They're not shutting down the campus by having their tents there. But at Columbia, for instance, in New York City, they set up their tents with 2 or 3 weeks left to go in classes, and they occupied a building so that they could impede the functioning of the university. That was the aim. This reasoning, that if we don't get our way, we'll shut everything down, that reasoning was voiced on January 6th by the insurrectionists who took over the Capitol building, trying to stop what they thought was a stolen election. This reasoning was used by Hamas on October 7th when they justified why they slaughtered innocent people. They said, well, nothing else was working. Palestine was no longer on the world agenda. So we had to do something. And Hamas has said very clearly that it wants Israel to disappear, to be erased from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. When student protesters at U of T hang up signs from the river to the sea, they are declaring that the time for debate and discussion is over. Israel should not exist. That's what those signs mean. From the river to the sea means that Israel should not exist. The Jewish people should disappear from what has been their traditional homeland. But how can Jews in this city feel safe as long as universities tolerate that kind of idea on campus, particularly when voiced by an illegal encampment? On Friday, I went to U of T just to check out what was going on, and the encampment is on King's College Circle, that beautiful big round green area on campus, and it's surrounded by fences that the university's put up. And if you come up from College Street, you come up the boulevard, you see the tents. One of the very first tent that you see has in big red letters, Palestine, from the sea to the river. Protests are about messaging. That's the first message you see when you go to U of T's encampment. Would it be okay for right-wing protesters to set up an encampment to protest gay rights on campus? Would that be okay, just because they really, really believed it? Or to set up an encampment to challenge the right of trans people to exist, because no one's been talking about it, or no one will listen to us, so we had to set up an encampment. Would that be okay? Universities are supposed to be places for learning the art of persuasion and engaging in a free flow of ideas. We're living in a time when activists on both sides of the political spectrum are acting with religious fervor, but without religious restraint. It's time that political activists catch up with what world religions learned the hard way. Dialogue and respect are more important than pretending that one group has all the right answers. Every major religion calls for the respect of all human beings, even when we disagree. Every one of us is a child of God, deserving of respect. We hold that human beings are never totally right. We never have all the right answers because only God is all-knowing. That kind of perfection can only be found in the mind of God, a kind of knowledge which is not available to mere mortals like us. That's humbling, and sometimes it can feel insulting, but it puts a check on how far we can go with our certainties. We can always be wrong. Maybe we don't understand where they're coming from. Maybe we shouldn't call for them to be pushed into the sea because we could be wrong, and we certainly are wrong whenever we ask for the absolute destruction of anybody else. In today's psalm, when humanity and God draw close together, we are told that the mountains sing and the rivers clap their hands. It's a wonderful, poetic image of voices from different kinds of beings all joining in song. In today's terms, we could say that they're singing in harmony, where each sings a different note as part of the same song. As we've heard this morning, singing in harmony produces a sound that is richer than when everyone is singing the same thing. God calls on us humans to sing in harmony. Many voices singing different notes in a song that celebrates human dignity, the beauty of the natural world, and our relationship to our Creator. And it doesn't all have to sound the same. Harmony is richer because it doesn't all sound the same. You may have noticed when the guys were giving that little demonstration, they weren't singing, it wasn't just in different pitches, they were singing different notes with each of their parts. In a place like Toronto, we have an opportunity here to actually hear the harmony of our humanity trying to figure out its way in the world by having people express themselves in different ways. And instead of trying to boil it all down to one message, I think we're being invited to hear multiple voices as part of a greater harmony of which we were just a part. And that's a new thing. It's barely 100 years that religions have been talking to each other. We can't pretend to understand where this is going. But one thing is certain. A greater beauty will come out of a harmony of voices talking and thinking about things in different ways than if we try to make everybody sing the same song. Harmony is a strength, not a weakness. So may we all sing together for an end to violence, for respect of the dignity of all human beings, and for the right for every being to thrive in God's wonderful world. Amen.